China has reset its priorities, and 2023 starts with a bang as the country is pulling out all the stops to revive economic growth. Chinese President Xi Jinping made that crystal clear at a tune-setting economic conference last December. How will China go about giving that much-needed boost to its economy? What fiscal policies are in the pipeline, and what could stand in the way and be a potential source of friction both at home and abroad? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. For the discussion, I was pleased to be joined from Sydney, Australia, by Professor David Goodman, Director of China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. From Beijing, by Professor Xue Lan, Dean of the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. From Washington, D.C., by Sourabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies, and from Portland, Oregon, by Professor Liang Yan, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. The warmest welcome to all of you. Professor Gupta, how would you compare the difficulties the world economy is facing at this particular moment with that of 2008? I mean, back then, China was in relatively good shape, and China and the United States were able to join hands, or China was able, to provide some kind of a relief for the United States and for other countries that were in deep trouble. Now you mentioned the tech war that the US has launched on China at this particular moment when the world economy is not looking at some good news. How much trouble is there going to be? And does the United States realize that this is probably not the best moment to launch a tech war on China when the world is very much in need of a collective economic recovery if we're not going to sink together?
I think you're absolutely correct on that front. There have been very drastic and draconian technology embargo and denial measures over the last 2 years. And the fruits of that, the bitter fruits of that, are going to be felt in the next year or two when there's a downturn in many of those tech sectors. But speaking of the broader global economy, I am not too pessimistic. The advanced economies are looking at some form of recession. Probably not a harsh recession, maybe a softer landing, but they are looking at a downturn in some respects. Emerging markets have held their own fairly well despite the real jacking up of the US interest rates and the pressure that it has placed on their currencies. But most of them have coped well. We know there are cases of debt distress, but most have coped well. And I am actually fairly optimistic about the Chinese economy becoming a motor of growth for the global economy, especially during the latter part of 2023. I think where the Chinese government is going, and rightly so, is to recharge the animal instincts of the private sector. That is what will grow the Chinese economy dynamically, and it will help the world economy in tow, even if the advanced economies are not doing that great, given the food, energy, and other challenges that we're facing. And therefore, I think the role for the Chinese government primarily is to kind of support economic growth, support the private sector, while not exacerbating the domestic economic imbalances and the risks to financial stability, and to provide support to consumption. The Chinese government needs to become a bigger player on the consumption side of the economy too, both short-term and, of course, as Professor Goodman mentioned, from a longer-term perspective. But I am not a pessimist in terms of growth, global growth in 2023. What I am, though, pessimistic about is that advanced economies and emerging economies can sit at the table and really push the multilateral economic agenda forward. I think there's too big of a gap, a differential in that, and there are too many policy differences for that process to really be recharged in 2023, even though the Indonesian G20 chairpersonship did a great job. So, but just talking growth, I'm more optimist than pessimist in 2023 because of China and because of emerging markets.
Well, according to a report released by the National Bureau of Statistics in November, China contributed up to 38.6% of world economic growth from 2013 to 2021. Now, with China's role as an economic engine being a little bit uncertain, at least at this particular point, are you still so optimistic, Professor Gupta, that the world economic performance will be rather rosy?
I would say the first 6 months of 2023 will be difficult because China itself is going to be facing difficulty, and the advanced economies are staring more at a downturn than an upturn. And therefore, we don't have real strong growth motors. But I am optimistic that come the second half of the year, at least at the Chinese end and at the emerging market end, they will be able to uphold global growth and stimulate it. The fact of the matter is, in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, it has been the non-Western countries which have been major stimulants of growth. And I see that dynamic continuing. And of course, it would be great to have growth also in the Eurozone and in the US economy. For them, it's more of a kind of a temporary or a transient downturn, one might say. But really, I think mid-year onwards, we can expect something good, not necessarily rosy, but the global economy finding its bearings once again and creating an opportunity for prosperity going forward in 2024 and thereafter.
Yeah, Professor Liang, on January the 8th, China has announced that it will lift inbound travel quarantine requirements. How much of a factor is that going to play on the domestic economy, on international communication, people-to-people exchange for sure, but how significant do you see that move?
Right. So I think this is going to be a probably gradual process where foreign investors and foreign tourists will start coming back to China, and also expats are coming back to China with this COVID restriction being, erased or being significantly watered down. So I think that would definitely be helpful for these kind of economic exchanges, for also people-to-people exchanges. And I think also more and more Chinese people would probably also going out, talking about, consumption demand or boosting consumer confidence. I think many tourism industry is going to see a revival of their businesses. And I also want to comment on some of the questions that I think are very interesting that you raised earlier. One has to do with the common prosperity. I think when it comes to providing more and wider and equal access to public services, I think that's definitely an emphasis of the government in the coming years. That is part of the common prosperity. On the other hand, I think income redistribution policy is probably going to be at the back burner. Just because I think economic security and growth are probably going to be the priorities for next year. And talking about global economy, I agree that I think by most of the forecasts, China is going to be part of the locomotives along with emerging Asia like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, India. But I think it's very difficult to tell, are we going to have a rosier year in 2023? And I think it really depends on two major factors. One is how the war between Russia and Ukraine are going to pan out and unfold. And for two, I think it also has really to do with how advanced countries, central banks are going to implement policies. If the United States is going to have the last rate hike in January and then stay put, that's probably going to be helpful to engineer soft landing. So do ECB, but that is a big unknown. So I think there's still a lot of uncertainties. And again, if you look at the IMF's forecast, they forecasted a lower growth rate for the global economy in 2023 at 2.7%. So I think there's still quite a lot of uncertainties, but I think what the Chinese government can do, I agree with Professor Gupta and the other speakers, is that we can remain vigilant and implement prudent monetary policy and proactive fiscal policy. And I would really strongly advocate for, of course, support for the consumers, even though I think most of the signs now point out I think the central government is still going to shore up and support businesses by way of, supporting the consumers rather than, directly giving cash handouts. But I think if the central government can, increase their fiscal transfer to the local governments and allow the local governments to help their businesses and consumers, I think that would be great.
Well, Professor Xue, let me go straight to you on this. What is the consideration when China makes its policies in terms of fiscal distribution or the gap, the allocation of resources between the national level government and the provincial level government? What is the complexity of trying to revive an economy the size of China with 1.4 billion people, 17 trillion US dollars in size?
Yeah, I think that's a huge, a hugely complicated issue. But I think certainly, the central allocation to local government usually comes in different formats. I think one often is coming, from sort of major, infrastructure projects and so on, and that supports the local development. And often that really comes with a string attached that you need to have a matchup from the local government. And so that's sort of the one part. The other part is also to provide some basic public service such as education. In many provinces, they are not able to to provide to have enough fund to fund their local education. So the central government would also allocate. So I think that at the moment, I think that many local governments are really sort of are quite tightly. I mean, over the last 3 years, they've already spent a lot of the their local finance, and so they really need the kind of central support to be able to provide sort of basic services. So I think that kind of support will be very much needed. And I think the other part of the central government support is to support local sort of innovation and local industrial development. And there, I think that in many cases, the best way is to give some more specific policies. And so I think China has various kind of policies, so experimental zones, and as we know that free trade zones, and those kind of policy support from the central government, I think also can play a big role.
All right. Well, let's move on to one bigger aspect where we have not yet elaborated on, which is the geopolitical situation. Professor Goodman, let me get your view. The war in Ukraine and also the rivalry between the United States and China. How much pressure is that going to be on the Chinese economy looking ahead for 2023, especially for the first half?
Well, I think Professor Gupta really dealt with a large part of that in his earlier comments. The pressures on China from conflict, economic conflict in particular, but conflict of that kind with the USA is quite severe. The US government, the current US government, as well as the previous US government, seem determined to bang the drum of competition moving towards conflict with China. That's not clearly something that's in the world's interests. Xi Jinping in New Year, once again, as at the Party Congress, talked about the importance of not just globalization for peace and stability, but also economic globalization. And that clearly is the case. A lot of, I live in Australia, a lot of fuss here is made over what is seen as an inevitable conflict between Taiwan and the mainland. But that's missing the point about the considerable amount of economic codependency that exists between the two entities. It's just not common sense, but it is something that the USA government has been pursuing. The question of Ukraine, of course, is somewhat different because it's a major problem in Europe, with the USA supporting the Ukrainian government, but not to the extent of being prepared to go to war to them. Well, the reason, I suppose, is because Russia is a nuclear force. But the problem is, the reason the Ukraine war has got bogged down, I think is twofold. One is that in the first place, the United States government was not listening to the concerns that Putin had about what was happening in Ukraine, whether they're justified or not. They weren't listening. And the other thing is that they're not going to go to war because of nuclear weapons.
In terms of the kind of pressure on the Chinese economy or on the security of the Chinese economy, Mr. Gupta, let me go to you there. In what specific terms will this geopolitical pressure demonstrate itself, manifest? In terms of specific pressure on the Chinese economy? You talk about the tech war between the two countries. In specific terms, how much pressure specifically is that going to have on the Chinese economy?
I'll be a little contrarian here and say, at least in the short term, not too much. It is going to have an impact on China's economy. But, China is a $17 trillion economy. It's not just technology that is across the board on which China depends. We are looking at these fourth industrial revolution technologies from a 10, 25-year time frame. And so it's not very useful to telescope it as to whether that will really have an impact on the very short term. Let me also frame this a little differently. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of the fourth industrial revolution and its value, but let me say this. China today is just getting to the cusp of being an advanced economy. It's a $12,500 per capita economy. Now think of South Korea. China's economic trajectory has been very similar to South Korea's. Now think of South Korea today. South Korea is a $35,000 economy, roughly, per capita. And yes, it has a few core technologies, but it doesn't have too many core technologies. It has a few, but it's a $35,000 economy. If China were to become a $35,000 economy per capita, it would be double the size of the United States. And so once we can get a little distracted by the fact that it's all about core technologies, but if China can just grow by itself through more balanced consumption-led growth and enhance its technology level, China will be an economy without peer. And so we shouldn't be too over-fixated on the technology element as being the determinant of how fast or how far China will go, at least in the short term. And if China can just do the things that it needs to do, it needs to stimulate the property sector, it needs to the strain on local government, it needs to become a more consumption-oriented society, more balanced, the very things President Xi has talked about in terms of dual circulation, common prosperity. I think China is fairly well set, but these are not easy transitions to make. That transition from being a high growth economy to a high quality development economy, that's a process which will play out, and core technologies is just part of that element to which of getting China to that level, I would say. Yeah.
Well, I would agree that, the tech supremacy is a much longer term goal, trajectory, let's say, or competition, and to show up the consumption would be a priority for the next months to come. Professor Liang, finally, let me go to you. As Professor Goodman stressed in the very beginning, President Xi emphasized the need for unity. It's not very common for President Xi, in this short form of an address, to emphasize that ours is a big country. It is only natural for different people to have different concerns or hold different views on the same issue. What matters, and I'm quoting him directly here, what matters is that we build consensus through communication and consultation. When the 1.4 billion Chinese work with one heart and one mind and stand in unity with a strong will, no task will be impossible and no difficulty insurmountable. Why do you think he's stressing that particular point? How much is unity a determining factor here, and how difficult is it in today's China to achieve that, because everybody has, their social media, their mobile internet, and they can, say or post things instantly.
Right. So I think one thing to bear in mind, I agree with Professor Gupta, that a lot of these challenges are mostly internal. There are external challenges, but they're mostly secondary because, China does not like other countries that are facing severe, energy and food crises. And I also agree that China could have this sort of internal indigenous innovations that could help China to achieve its long-term efficiency goals, which I think are very important because you can have a continued extensive growth. You have to increase efficiency and productivity. But mostly, I think what is important is to boost domestic, as we all know, the three pillars in demand. There is a consumption demand that we need to improve. Then we have the investment with the real estate sector being in slum that has slowed down, and exports. And I think as we all understand, next year the global demand may be dampened because of interest rate hikes, and also other countries, take Germany as example. This year they still have some storage of gas, but next year, the energy crisis
We're talking
is not
about
going to magically go away.
2023. Yeah.
That's correct, 2023. So I think there are still a lot of issues with the war. It's not just the energy, but also, the two warring countries account for 12% of the global calorie trade. So I think there's a lot of aftermath that, all the countries in the world are going to face with. But for China, I agree. The pivot is supposed to be towards domestic, right? We need to have the domestic market, domestic demand. And so I think it's time that all these grounds have been built, that we need to come up with, common goals and common policies that would help to create this kind of buy-in, would create this kind of unity to push the countries forward. But I think what President Xi is emphasizing here is, yes, with communication, with greater unity, with these common goals, we're able to overcome all these external pressures and challenges in order to, increase our demand, domestic demand, build the domestic unified markets, and to promote indigenous innovations.
Finally, Professor Xue, you deal with young people. Deal is the wrong word, probably. You live with, you are in the world of young people, which is another group that President Xi addressed specifically. Besides unity, he talked about the importance of youth and their view, their growth, their development. What specific message is he sending through that?
I think that message is critically important, because I think that part of the geopolitical situation we see today is that indeed I think that we have not paid enough attention for promoting the communication and collaboration among different countries over the last 40 years when we are developing. And I think now today I think that China is emerging, play a bigger role in the world stage, and there's a tremendous need to promote that understanding and that collaboration and so on. So that's part of the reason why Schwarzman College was started, in 2013, and we are trying to, play some role in really getting, young people from every corner of the world to come to Tsinghua and to spend a year and working together, sharing their views and challenging each other, and also trying to find creative solutions for the future world. I think that kind of effort is what's really needed, in the world. If possible, let me add one more point on the technology issue. I think I couldn't. I think agree with Professor Gupta more on that point. I think when we talk about technology, I think, of course, the cutting edge technology is important, but also the diffusion of mature technology is also critically important for an economy of Chinese size. So I think that's something that we should pay much more attention to. I think that's where I think China will gain hugely in terms of productivity growth, where I think that's the critical for economic growth. I think, having said that, we also shouldn't underestimate the negative impact of the tech war between U.S. and China, because the U.S. is not just, sort of sanctioned on particular semiconductor technology. It's really having an impact on the global value chain because of the U.S. Basically any companies that's related to those technologies are no longer able to do business with China, and that impact is huge. And so, but I also wanted to say here that effort is going to hurt not only Chinese economy, but also U.S. economy and the global economy. As we've already seen, the global semiconductor industry suffered hugely.
Right.
Because China was the largest consumer of the global semiconductor industry, before the this tech war. And also, I think so that shifting of global value chain will have a negative impact on the global economy. We are talking about the cost might go up. And also that shifting of global value chain may also have climate implications as well, because we are moving production from where I think is highly efficient and actually over the years have become much cleaner production to where I think that environmental implications are much greater. So I think everybody is losing.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it takes time for matters to develop and for people to realize what are the real consequences of certain policies, just as what we see from the consequences of the trade war. It's probably going to take a little bit of time till things clear up. But definitely, as President Xi mentioned, just as polishing makes jade finer, adversity makes one stronger. We do have to work very hard in the year 2023, not just for ourselves, but for everybody's sake.